Welcome to the final installment of Are You Smarter Than the Libertarians? Deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. If you've stuck with me through the past three episodes, you deserve a medal or at least extra credit on your Libertarian report card. I'm Jeff, and today we're bringing it all together by looking at a case study that hits close to home. Education, specifically Black education in America. Its inspiring achievements, misguided reforms, and sobering tragedies. Our focus is on a legendary institution you might not have heard of, Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. The rise and fall of Dunbar is like a microcosm of the 20th century Black experience, full of lessons about accountability, or the lack thereof, in our educational system. Let's set the stage. It's the late 19th and early 20th century. America is segregated by law in many places. In Washington, the nation's capital, Black and white students attend separate schools. Now, you might assume Black schools were uniformly terrible, inherently inferior, as the Supreme Court would later say. But hold on. There was a high school for Black students in D.C. that was absolutely shattering expectations. It was called M Street School, later named Dunbar High. This school produced academic excellence that rivaled, even exceeded, many white schools. Don't take my word for it. In 1899, standardized tests were given across D.C.'s four academic high schools, three white, one Black. The Black school, Dunbar, outscored two of the three white schools. Yes, you heard that right. A segregated Black public high school in 1899 was breathing down the necks of the elite white schools for top performance. Less than 40 years out from slavery, African-American kids, many from working-class families, were out-testing white kids from more privileged backgrounds. If that doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. The achievements didn't stop at test scores. Dunbar High, as it was later renamed after poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, became a factory of excellence. By the mid-20th century, it had produced numerous Black professionals and pioneers. The first Black man to graduate from Annapolis, that's a Naval Academy, the first Black woman to earn a PhD in the United States, the first Black federal judge, the first Black general, the first Black cabinet member, and many more trailblazers. By 1970, Dunbar had turned out more Black PhD holders than any other high school in the country. And remember, this was during segregation when resources were scant. How on earth did they do it? Sowell digs into the factors. Dunbar, it turns out, had something money can't easily buy, a culture of high expectations and disciplines. Its teachers were often themselves highly educated. When talented Black scholars were denied jobs at white institutions, many ended up teaching at Dunbar. The school encapsulated pride and accountability in students. Tardiness and misbehavior were not tolerated. One principal was so strict he'd personally escort misbehaving kids to their parents' workplace to make sure the parents knew what's up. Can you imagine that today? Dunbar students knew that because opportunities in society were limited by racial prejudice, they had to be twice as good to make it, and they rose to the challenge. Crucially, Sowell points out, Dunbar was not a school just for the Black elite. In one 1890s graduating class, the parents' occupation included dozens of laborers, messengers, janitors, only one doctor. Many Dunbar students were poor or came from less literate homes. So much for the excuse that you can't expect kids from poverty to excel. Dunbar's success flat out defies the modern dogma. The school's secret wasn't cherry-picking only wealthy Black kids. It was good old-fashioned education values. Order, work, merit. As Sowell later quipped, the biggest secret is that there are no secrets, unless work is a secret. Work seems to be the only four-letter word that can't be used in public today. Boom. That quote hit like a freight train of truth. At Dunbar, hard work wasn't a secret, it was expected. So for decades, through the early 1900s up to World War II and beyond, Dunbar High stood as a beacon. It was separate, but definitely not inferior by any empirical measures. It's important to acknowledge this because it complicates the narrative we often hear, that all Black schools were inevitably failing due to segregation. Dunbar wasn't failing, it was thriving. Academically and in building character, it had its own legacy of excellence. Enter the mid-1950s, the Civil Rights era is dawning. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education, declaring that racially separate schools are inherently unequal. It was a landmark victory for justice, right? In principle, yes, it struck down legal segregation, which was a huge moral wrong. However, and here comes the paradox, one could practically see Dunbar raising his hand from the back of the class saying, Your Honors, we respectfully disagree. We're a shining counterexample. In fact, Dunbar was a living refutation of the assumption that only integrated schools can be high quality. It's set just a few blocks from the Supreme Court itself, as if destiny wanted to taunt that simplistic conclusion. Now, nobody is saying segregation was good, but Sowell urges us to recognize that forced integration wasn't a magic pill either, and in Dunbar's case, it tragically destroyed something special. How so? After Brown, D.C., which wasn't under the same state laws as others but followed the integration spirit, decided to reorganize schools. The city's politicians implemented a neighborhood school policy for integration. Dunbar, which had previously been a citywide magnet of sorts, attracting top black students from all over D.C., was now turned into a normal neighborhood school. Translation: instead of selecting motivated students and having involved parents from across the city, Dunbar had to accept everyone from the local attendance zone, which happened to be low-income, high-crime areas of D.C. After all, segregated housing meant Dunbar's vicinity was a black ghetto. Almost overnight, Dunbar went from an elite academic haven to a typical inner-city school. The results? Catastrophic. The culture of excellence evaporated as unruly students flooded in, and the focused students were diluted. Discipline collapsed. Many of Dunbar's dedicated teachers either retired or transferred rather than watch their life's work be undone. Within a few years in the late 1950s, Dunbar High became just another struggling, underperforming school plagued by the same issues: truancy, low achievement, violence that you would find in other segregated ghetto schools. More than 80 years of continuous academic excellence simply vanished into thin air. It's one of the most dramatic flameouts in U.S. educational history, yet few people know about it. Why? Because it doesn't fit that feel-good narrative. Brown versus Board is supposed to be an unequivocal triumph, and in the broad legal sense, it was, but on the ground in places like D.C., the way integration was implemented wiped out a center of black excellence that segregation, ironically, had allowed to flourish. Sowell doesn't mince words here. This was a disaster begotten by good intentions and arbitrary social engineering. He notes that no serious opposition was raised to what was happening to Dunbar because integration was the sacred goal of the moment, drowning out all other concerns. Who would dare say, wait, maybe we're harming those black students by dismantling their institution when integration's promise looms so large? But someone should have. This is a classic case where ideological visions that integrated equals automatically better steamrolled over empirical reality that Dunbar was doing a fantastic job as it was. In Sowell's terms, history was sacrificed to vision. This ties directly into accountability. The education establishment and political leaders did not hold themselves accountable to results. They chased a vision of racial balance as an end in and of itself. They assumed that mixing black kids with white kids was the only way black kids could learn, effectively ignoring contrary evidence and implicitly, rather than insultingly, suggesting black kids needed white kids around to achieve. Sowell lampoons that mindset as the white kid's burden, akin to the old white man's burden colonial ideology. It's a biting analogy. In trying to right one wrong, they committed another by not considering that black students were fully capable of excellence on their own. True accountability would have asked, what are our educational goals? Better learning or just different seating charts? If academic excellence was the goal, Dunbar's model should have been preserved or replicated, not obliterated. This isn't to say integration was all bad. Many black students did benefit from access to resources at formerly white-only schools, especially in places where black schools were truly awful. But Dunbar and a few others like it showed that the formula for success was not skin color mix, but a mix of high standards, order, and hard work. Those intangibles got lost in the shuffle in pursuit of a racial utopia. They inadvertently threw out the educational baby with the bathwater. There's also a tragic irony here. In the late 19th and 20th century, when there was rampant racism and few rights, the black schools thrived. By the late 20th century, after civil rights victories, the now integrated schools languished. One might bitterly joked that Dunbar was defeated not by white supremacists, but by well-meaning liberals. It's a stark reminder that policies can have unintended consequences, even morally driven ones. Good intentions are not enough. You have to check if the outcomes align with those intentions. That's accountability in governance. Sowell's essay, Black Education, Achievement, Myths, and Tragedies, doesn't just stop at Dunbar. He broadens the discussion to debunk a lot of fashionable ideas in education. For instance, he criticizes the notion, popular in the 70s, that Black kids need Afrocentric curricula or same-race role models to learn. He points out that Dunbar succeeded with a traditional curriculum, and often Black students had white teachers and principals early on. It didn't matter. They excelled. He also skewers the idea that busing kids across town for racial balance was necessary for quality. He calls that the de facto white child's burden idea, that a Black child can only learn if a white child is sitting nearby. Sowell notes studies found no empirical support for the assumption that diversity by itself improved learning. Shocking, I know. Simply having a rainbow of kids in a classroom doesn't raise test scores. Who could have guessed? Perhaps any teacher actually in a classroom could have, I'm guessing. In fact, after decades of busing and forced integration, many cities found little academic improvement and a lot of bitterness and white flight. Some places like Cleveland and Kansas City poured vast sums into desegregation plans with magnet schools and still saw flat results. It turns out that quality education is not a formula of Black plus white equals success. It's more like discipline plus rigor equals success, regardless of racial mixing. They come to learn this again in recent times, with many prominent minority charter schools achieving great results by emphasizing structure and academics, essentially a return to Dunbar's ethos. Let's not forget another myth, that poverty or racial stigma inherently prevent academic achievement. Dunbar's early history blows that up, as does the example of many other historically Black schools and colleges that thrived despite segregation. Accountability means we can't just shrug and say, these kids are poor, what can we do? We have evidence that you can do a lot, but you have to have the will to enforce standards and not use poverty as an excuse for failure, even as we work to alleviate it. As we conclude this series, I want to highlight the overarching theme one last time, accountability. In episode 1, we saw the need for cultural accountability, not excusing destructive behaviors under the guise of authentic culture. In episode 2, we confronted historical accountability, acknowledging the full scope of slavery and giving credit as well as blame where due. In episode 3, we discussed accountability and attitudes, resisting the temptation to blame successful minorities for broader problems and instead taking responsibility for one's own achievement. And here, in the 4th episode, is about accountability and social policy, measuring lofty ideals against real-world outcomes and being willing to course correct when the data says, this isn't working. The story of Dunbar High is painful because it shows that progress is not a straight line upward. Gains can be lost. A community that had built an educational jewel lost it, partially by trusting the external solution more than their own proven methods. It underlines a libertarianish point. Sometimes local knowledge and organic solutions outperform top-down mandates. The educators and family of Dunbar knew what worked for their kids. Outsiders with legal authority, even with noble aims, imposed a change that inadvertently wrecked that success. Perhaps a more accountable approach would have been gradual integration, allowed Dunbar to remain a magnet, open to white students even, rather than destroying its core. Or replicate Dunbar's model in other schools rather than dispersing the student body and faculty to the wind. But the voice of those who wanted to save Dunbar were drowned out by the triumphal courses of integration now. And Dunbar never regained its prominence despite new buildings and more funding. To this day, many urban schools struggle. It's a sobering caution that even the best-intentioned reforms need reality checks. We must ask, are we doing what makes us feel virtuous, or what actually helps kids learn? Because sometimes those aren't the same thing. Let me leave you with a mental image. Picture a relay race through time. The baton is quality education. In the early 1900s, a team of Black educated students at Dunbar take the baton and sprint like champions, defying all obstacles. Then mid-century, society comes in and says, we'll take it from here, but fumbles the handoff. The baton drops. Who picks it up now? In many ways, we're still scrambling to recover it, trying new approaches, some old school, no pun intended, and some innovative. The moral is that success is fragile and accountability means owning the responsibility to sustain it once achieved. It's fitting to end on that note because Sowell's work throughout Black, Rednecks, and White Liberals challenges us to dispense with convenient fantasies and comfort the world and confront the world as it is, and to uphold standards even when it's tough or unpopular. Whether it's holding individuals accountable for cultural behaviors, or nations accountable for historical truths, or majorities accountable for how they treat minorities, or educators and policymakers accountable for the results of their grand experiment. It all comes down to not dodging reality. I hope this 4-part series has been stimulating for you as it has for me. We went for a bold, unapologetic look at Sowell's ideas, mixing some humor, gallows humor at times, and storytelling. Maybe you found yourself nodding in agreement at some points and shaking your head in disbelief at others. That's okay. The goal was to get us all thinking and questioning. If I've done that, then mission accomplished. At the end of the day, being smarter than a libertarian or anyone isn't about winning trivia or spouting dogma. It's about being willing to look honestly at evidence, challenge orthodoxy, and yes, hold ourselves and our community to high standards. Thomas Sowell, love him or loathe him, exemplifies that contrarian commitment to truth over comfort. So thank you for joining me on this journey. Stay curious, stay accountable, and never shy away from asking that awkward question. As Sowell might say, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, and it is on us to make those trade-offs wisely. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. New videos drop every day. As always, stay free, stay informed, stay accountable.